Okay, we are now here. Good morning, welcome, good afternoon. We are here at another Greaterthan session at the Networks Festival, working with Source as the foundation for shared leadership and organization. And I'm Anna, I'm with the Greaterthan team, and I am here to welcome our facilitators, our hosts that are going to hold this session. So with me today is Nadja Taranczewski. I'm going to say it the Polish way. Francesca Pick from Greaterthan, and Johannes. I'm sorry, Johannes, I'm not even going to try.
Hochholzer, very German name.
Thank you. And the reason we're holding this session and why it's so important for us at Greaterthan, and why in this context of the Network Festival, is that we find that this is often a blind spot, the spot of how to transform leadership that is really aligned with mission and impact and intentions, and to introduce source work into this realm, I would say. And for us as Greaterthan, this is an ongoing thing we're experimenting with. This is one of many methodologies and frameworks in which we're looking at leadership. So we're also here, and Fran's here to talk about that experimentation that we've been doing at Greaterthan. So with that, welcome to my host, and over to you.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here with Nadja and Johannes to dive into this topic. I've met both Nadja and Johannes in different parts of my journey in exploring Source over quite a few years now. And yeah, it was really important to me that we host this session at the festival, because it's just become what feels like such an important foundation of actually creating the type of organizations and leadership that I think we would like to see more of in the world. So just really briefly to give you a sense of what's ahead, this session has sort of a couple different elements. We're going to kick off briefly with introduction into just very basic understanding of what are source principles, what is this actually about, just to make sure that those of you who have never heard about this, which I'm sure there are several here, get a quick understanding. After that, we're going to dive into an interview where Nadja is going to interview Johannes and I about our really practical experiences with applying this in our respective initiatives and projects. And then it's going to really go over to you, and we're going to have exercise in small groups where you're really going to be able to think about what this might mean for you, what it brings up, and how you might actually be able to apply this in your own life and work. So one thing that's really important is that if you do want to join that second part where it's going to be participatory, we just want to make sure that you're really here and present. And so we invite you to add to your name a 1 at the beginning that just indicates that you want to join those breakouts. We'll also remind you again a bit later on, but if you can already jump in and do that, it's great. Then we know that you want to participate. Okay, so I think with that, I'm going to pass over to Nadja to dive us into this topic.
Thank you, Francesca. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. It's great to be here today. So maybe one thing about who we are, we decided to not waste any of our precious time on that. I think, Fran, you have a link for anybody who wants to read up why we are here and why we feel we're entitled to talk about this. So let me start by saying that source work is something that we didn't develop. It's a term that has been coined by our wonderful friend and teacher, Peter Koenig. And Peter has been developing tools and systems really to expand consciousness and human development for probably more than 40 years. Peter today is in his mid-70s. So Peter based source work not on theory, but rather on his observations regarding all kinds of human initiatives. And then based on these observations, he distilled the natural principles by which they operate. So when we look at our collaborative endeavors, right, and anything ranging from families to companies, and we see them as creative processes and living systems, then source work can help us to understand the natural emergent hierarchies which give them shape. And I think at this point, it's really important to remember that nature itself is not free of hierarchies. So as much as we often want to get away from that, there is probably a role for that. As we continue to unpack this, and I'm going to share 3 of Peter's most significant observations that led to the development of source work, you can notice what happens inside of you, right? So notice where you go in resonance, what feels right to you intuitively, notice any resistance you have or disbelief, and also notice any physical reactions, because those are important, and we'll take that a little deeper when you go into the breakouts later. So the first observation is that every initiative has one person, and one person only, who is the overall creative author. And we call that person the source. So this person who's source did not just have an idea, but they actually took a risk, the first sort of vulnerable step to realize their vision. And the source has a very special and different connection. We would nearly say sort of a deeper knowing about what the initiative needs than any other person in the system. In the process of sourcing, they also instill their core values into the DNA of the initiative. So there is a very personal connection. However, despite this personal connection, you can understand source as a kind of temporary guardianship of an initiative. So it can be handed over, right? It's not fixed. And for as long as that source person is the guardian, they are deeply passionate and protective of the initiative. And if you've ever been source in anything, you will know this feeling. The second observation is that being source is independent of any official ownership structures or formalized hierarchy. Yeah, so source does have a hierarchy, but it's more what you might know if you're familiar, for example, with constellation work. There's always this moment where you notice that the lack of acknowledgement of a natural hierarchy, in our case, we would say of source, it appears to upset something. And that often leads to symptoms, and they can range from power struggles to confusion to an overall weakening of the initiative. And the third observation that Peter made was in any initiative involving more than one person, one of the main roles of the first source, what we call the global source, is actually to attract and to support other people who are ready to be what we then call a specific source, because that's what's really needed to grow their field. And specific sources are connected to this bigger field or initiative, but they're also autonomous in their own right. So they need space to develop their part of the vision in the way they see fit, while at the same time honoring and staying within the outer edge that has been defined by the source. And analog to leadership, we call this sourceship. So to us, that's the missing piece in developing successful self-organization in which people, on the one hand, honor a natural order, but at the same time have the freedom and take responsibility for their own vision. And to make this come alive with, sort of actual live, real lived examples, we will now transition to the part where I have the honor to interview both Francesca and Johannes about their experiences of working with source in their fields. Yeah, so I'm really excited to hear from the two of you. Francesca, let me start with you. I'm curious, and Johannes, you'll be answering the same question. But what is for you the essence of source work, and how has it affected your leadership?
Yeah, thank you, Nadja. I mean, I think it's a big question, and there's so many different things that come to my mind when I think about that. I think that to me, what you were saying before about how it expresses a type of structure and also an energy that exists in any initiative and any group that is doing something together, that it names that often invisible energy, and it helps you consciously work with it in that way. I think for me, what's really has made a really big difference, and also then affected how I am integrating that into my own work, is the fact that it feels like it's giving a nuance or like broadening out this idea of like what is leadership, but not even only leadership, but this idea of guardianship and caring deeply about something that one is creating. So it's like the relationship to your own creation, and doing it in a way that feels just completely different from the systems that I think we're trying to get away from. So that really is focused on this idea of power with others, that's really emphasizing this need of listening and sensing what's needed, and is not in any way based on like power over or any kind of coercive energy, let's say. So for me, there's the thing that it really feels contributes is that it's adding this nuance and this new way of looking at something that I think is really essential. Yeah, I'll say more about the leadership piece later.
Obviously, there's more to say, but I'd love to hear from you, Johannes. What is sort of your relationship with this concept or the principles of source?
So I would try to describe my personal relationship to it. So when I was part of different organizations, I was always struck by the different quality of, you could say, interaction. Let's phrase it broadly, which was, in my experience, not at all related to whether it was a hierarchical organization or a self-organized organization. I was like, okay, that's interesting. I was like convinced that we all need to switch to something like self-organized management or something. But I didn't see the quality that I wanted, that I thought or dreamed of or also experienced there. So what the essence for me about source work is that we switch to a perspective of creativity. So we essentially want to create something that is potentially new, that hasn't been there, or that is maybe also just new to me. So it's how can we create conditions that this creativity, that me maybe being the source or maybe others sourcing something and I'm joining in, can be supportive of everybody joining in and potentially also becoming sources. And this really shifted my perspective because, for example, when coming into organizations, I always was interested into the history, and I didn't know why. From the source perspective, it makes completely sense because you ask the question of like, who initially sourced it, who started something. And I work a lot with artists, and in the artist sphere, it's sometimes really clear who is the source because it comes from this creative approach. And then you have artists transferring to a collective endeavor, and suddenly everything is messy again. So I think, yeah, this perspective of creativity helps me a lot to think of like how to nourish this creativity, and their source principles are then like an important stepping stone.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think this what you just named to me is also the sort of the essence of it. The question is really, how do you connect everybody in a field to their creative flame, right? And then how do you organize that power that exists between people? But let's start with something or continue with something that is potentially controversial, because I find that there's always an elephant, especially in the green room, when we come from a spirodynamic lens and we have the green meme, right, where we all try to be equal and on eye level. What to you is the difference between source and traditional hierarchy or even patriarchy? And Johannes, maybe I'll start with you because Francesca, you already said a little bit about that. You can go deeper if you want, but I'd be curious to hear from you, Johannes.
The way that I try to think about it is that, so I come from Germany. And in Germany, the word power or even leader translated to German is like the worst thing you could be in the history of our country. So that means that hierarchy is quite often reframed as something bad. And I think that is not the case, because if you look at it as this temporal order of sources, it is like you described it, Nadja, a natural emerging hierarchy. Somebody who started something earlier, who took the risk first, becomes the first source. So my approach to this is, can we live with this order in a way that is not influenced by the patriarchal system that we're currently embedded in. So I see it as two different things, but quite often if we hear hierarchy or power, we just switch to that negative of no power, please, no, don't do that because it comes from our own histories. But for me, it's not contained in the concept, and that's why like untangle it and then see like how can we live with these hierarchies, because my experience is if we honor them in a way that doesn't come from like more from this power with perspective, it's powerful like like crazy. So that would be my try to answer that.
Yeah, I think oh, you're on mute, Nadja.
I am indeed. Do you want to elaborate a bit on what you already touched upon in your first share?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Johannes was also already saying it, that it's like we're swimming so deeply in the water of patriarchy because obviously we're all products of the system that we're in. And so I do think that this risk of it being misused or misunderstood is very high, the source principles. And that's definitely something that I feel we are being confronted with a lot. And that it's really about, yeah, what is the environment that we bring that lens into? And yeah, it's like flipping the foundation of what it is we're actually trying to do. Like in service of what are we using this, right? And I guess what I also find really intuitive and something that you can just observe, I think, when you're doing your work and once you sort of start looking out for it, is this idea of the natural hierarchies that just exist based on how people, yeah, have arrived, have created things, how they relate to different initiatives. That when you are in flow with that and acknowledging it, you don't need any force. You don't need to like create any kind of like, I think all of those things that we're afraid of when we say, oh God, we don't want power and like we don't want to, yeah, to be micromanaged or to be managed at all or be forced to do anything. That when you're actually really working with source principles well, from my experience, that then none of that is needed anymore because it's actually much more fluid.
Yeah. And that fluidity I have come to find incredibly fascinating, because from the outside, if you look at a well aligned source field, it actually does look as if we're making all decisions together, because in a way we are, right? But it has to do with everybody's connection to, I don't know, that higher field of possibility or something, right? So there's something there that is yeah, that just flows. And I'm Christina, I'm seeing your question in the chat of what are source principles. I'm assuming you came a bit late because we covered that in the beginning. I'm going to try to put some stuff in the chat while Francesca and Johannes talk. But the next question I would have for Francesca, you is, you know, given what you've already touched upon here, what are the biggest benefits for you having looked at your initiative through a lens of source, and how do you nurture that in your field?
Yeah, so my background is basically having worked in very sort of self-organized, distributed networks, groups, communities for many years. And I think one of the big lessons that had already appeared a while back was this idea that we need to put in place intentional structures and yeah, principles that support us actually to do that work. And so I think there's this writing by this woman, Jo Friedman, about the tyranny of structurelessness that we often reference, which I think is many of the sort of myths around self-organizing, which is like, oh, you just take away everything, no structure, no hierarchy, and then it just does itself, right? And that doesn't work. And so for me, the real benefit that I've seen with the source principles is that I guess it gives what feels like a much deeper and more powerful approach to the type of structure, quote. I don't even want to really use that word, but it's like it's a way to give structure to an initiative, but that isn't very focused on process, or that's connected to creative energy of people. And I think it makes so much sense because one of the other, I guess, long experiences that many of us had made in community work is that you try to connect with the energy of the people that are there. And Like whether something happens or not is not because, someone is paying you to do it, but because it's like who has energy to do it. That's been a principle for so long. And I feel like Source just helps give a bit more clarity and understanding to that. And I also think that especially in initiatives where there's so much entrepreneurial energy and you have these sort of like networks of networks and ecosystem where there's lots of people that are starting all types of things, my experience has been that Source is even more essential in that context because it helps you understand how do all these different things relate to each other and who do we need to be checking in about what we're doing to make sure that we're not like diverging too far or getting completely off track with what we started out to do. And I think it's next level difficult in these types of ecosystems because sometimes you're not sure or people have really different understandings. So I've had just a really positive experience of what's called creative field mapping, which is basically an exercise of drawing different circles, concentric circles that are inside each other to get a sense of what are all the different creative fields, who's holding them, and how do they relate to each other. And even just the process of doing that is like so clarifying.
Yeah, it is very clarifying. And, and I'm just thinking of examples that many of us might know of. For example, something like the Burning Man Festival, right? Where you don't have a person or a body that is centrally organizing this entire festival, but there is this understanding, I think, much to your question of who has energy for that, who feels inspired to. And then there are some ground rules around if you do anything there, you need to bring all of your own shit and you need to take everything away when you leave. But beyond that, there's very little restrictions in there. So people are really invited to find their own creative source and to express that in the best way possible and contribute from that place. So Johannes, what's your experience? Like, how has it shifted how you work in your field?
So what I did was I think for the first time really looked at all the initiatives that I had been part of from a source perspective and realized certain patterns. So for example, when I could establish a good relationship with the main source, like Francesca said, if the energy is there, contributions and collaboration started like being really fluent. And one interesting pattern that I've seen is that I have a certain tendency of being something that you could call a second source. So somebody has an idea, shares that risk of going somewhere, sharing it, or investing the first money, or starting something. And then I come in and I'm usually like, I even try to find a title for it. I call it in German, it's Form geben. So in English, it translates to like giving shape. So I quite often come in as a source of like, which shape does this now actually take? And this can be in the legal perspective, this can be in the product perspective, this can be in the what do we actually do here perspective. And so what I noticed is when I then acknowledge the source and support that source fully by not bringing my own ideas in, but like listening to the field, I achieve we achieve actually completely different results because I'm not focused on my expectations or my ideas about it, but like really coming from this creativity of the person of the source starting it and supporting that because it might be blocked.
If I may interject there for a moment, because I think you're touching upon two really interesting parts. The first one is what you just described is actually the process of how what we would call either a subsource or specific source emerges in somebody's field, right? So you're inspired by the first outline of a vision that somebody has created, and then you feel called forth to contribute to this vision, to this field, to the best of your abilities. And it is actually, a very common observation that we've made that the source themselves quite often needs translation help, right? So they have this vision, but somehow to put that into clear language that other people can understand and follow isn't always the easiest. So they often need somebody like you, like the role you just described, that helps them articulate that in a way that can actually transmit, right? And then the second piece you said is this knowing that there is a time and a space to hold your own agenda back and really go into sensing together with the source and helping them articulate more clearly. While at the same time, I would assume there's also a time and a space for you to go more clearly into your own sourcing then, right? So I'm curious into that in that connection.
That's the challenge that I'm now seeing really freshly in my leadership, that I have the tendency of stepping really strongly into that sensing and supporting the other person. And that's a quality that I somehow bring. However, now I'm sitting with the question of Johannes inside the organizations that you have currently are part of, and in my own life, what is something that I really want to source? Because for me it becomes now much clearer that I have this tendency of being attracted to somebody having a vision. And now I'm just like always walking around of like, would this be something that I would like to source by myself? What do I need? And then I also start questioning of, it's easy to spot certain dynamics of powers in somebody else being the source. But do I really spot them in myself? Who do I maybe need around me that I can be like the good source that I hope for? So it's like I become much more critical of me starting things because I'm aware of the whole dynamics that I attract. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful that you bring that into the space, because that's actually a question I didn't even think about beforehand. But what do you think is the role then of inner work for sources so that they can do what you just said, which is to be the best source they can be and not begin to replicate all of the old crap that we don't want to have anymore?
Francesca, you just unmuted. Do you want to
Yeah, but I
jump
mean,
in?
it wasn't on that specific question. It was semi-related, like more building on what you were just saying. Can I jump in, Nadja?
Yes,
Then
please go
please
ahead.
do, and then we go to the inner
Yes.
work.
I mean, I feel like it maybe is a bit of a bridge to that, but I think you know, in initiatives, we all are wearing a lot of different hats. And I think one of the real challenges for me has been to really actually start noticing, when am I sort of in that quote source mode? Like, when am I really connected to myself and connected to the initiative and its purpose and speaking from that place, like actually properly speaking from that place? And when am I maybe just being Francesca connected to a other part of the initiative or something else, or just myself, right? Like, there's so many different ways that we're going to be showing up. And I think being able to discern, like, when am I authentically speaking from that place? And this has been a real challenge, I think also in Greaterthan, is actually having others around you help you with that. And really like supporting each other. Like, when are you authentically speaking from which place regarding what you're doing? And yeah, I think that's also just related to generally some of the maybe the pushback and the challenges that one can get around this. But I think it's been hard for me to, I guess, get the support, and maybe that's just because it's one of my own challenges of getting help from others when I need it. But I think that's something like we can't really do that alone, and it's so essential. And that's also what we often talk about, of this idea of like needing to get clear as a source and not just being in doubt. And I think it's really important to have other people that tell you like, oh no, right now you're not at all speaking from a place of that groundedness, but maybe you're being reactive, or you're speaking from fear, or like from other places basically. And I guess inner work is essential for that.
Well, exactly, right? Because that for me is actually the bridge. So I'm curious, Johannes, how do you see then the connection between inner work and your ability to know when are you speaking from ego, right? And when are you speaking from source? Because I think they're two very different stances.
What I love about the source principles or source work in general, that it's like for me a map that gives me orientation. And then in this map, I can put anything in that's suitable for me. So for example, I use a lot of body work for myself, which is not applicable for everyone. But I then go through like, how is my feeling in the body when doing something? And then I explore that. And through that, I, for example, found out that if I am in certain calls or invited to a project and I just have a strong feeling in my body of like, this is somehow strange, or even I do the research of finding out who could be the source of something because it's not always clear, and then I start speaking to that person, and I cannot relate on a certain level, or my body is like, oh, it doesn't feel right, even though it would be a great collaboration, there would be money or whatever in it. I have learned to follow this intuition of my body to say, okay, it needs to go a different path. And this is, for example, one approach of like inner caretaking that helps me. And so everybody can just insect any kind of work that adds awareness to the dynamics that happen when being in a creative field. That it's and I over time I'm less I don't enforce my ideas so much because I have like this would be the perfect idea how to run this organization. It's like, okay, this would be my idea. Let's look at the source, or let's find out who's sourcing this. What would be supportive? Does something work? Can we try a different path? And then I suddenly tap into creativity again. It's
Yeah.
not like me enforcing something, and so I step into also my own source mode. Yeah, I will stop here because
Yeah. Yeah.
it could be a
No,
long.
but I think what you're both speaking to is ultimately it, of course, when I'm sourcing something, I do have a vision, but I need to be connected to the fact that it's not really about me, right? I often feel that there is sort of a bigger field of possibility. And when you source something, it can sometimes even feel like you were the wrong person in the wrong spot at the wrong time, yeah, right? Because there's this download and then it chases you around, right? If you reject it, it will come back to you over and over again until you sort of agree, okay, there seems to be something for me to do. And then being connected to that creates the question of how do I make this flourish? And I think that is the guiding question then in the field, right? And then as source, my question to anybody in the field is also how do I help you to flourish with the vision that you have? And I'm also sort of halfway monitoring the chat in the background. So there's a lot going on. So one question was about, the usual question, and maybe you guys want to speak to that. Can there be two sources? Francesca, what's your take on that?
I mean, I think that it's very clear if you look into this or like understood the general principle is that there cannot be more than one source. And I think this is definitely the initial reaction that I guess many people in spaces that are more focused on working in participatory ways that are distributing power, that's often a reaction of like, yeah, there's a lot of upset about that and something that gets a lot of pushback. And again, I think it sort of negates the general principle that there's a certain quality of a relationship that one person has with that initiative. Like it loses its function as a map if it can be multiple people. And I think what to me seems like a real challenge to work with is that I've also experienced, especially in Greaterthan, that that idea that there can only be one, somehow it sometimes reinforces this idea that it's just about this one person, or also that it diminishes the contributions of others. And I don't see that at all to be the case, but somehow that is often a narrative that keeps popping up. So it feels like that's something that, I don't know, just isn't quite landing, or that, maybe it's pointing towards other elements. Also, I think one thing that I can definitely say for myself is that when you're doing work that's really impact driven and you're really passionate about it and you're sort of like, you're just very intertwined personally with what you do, I think I went through a bit of a loop of feeling maybe a bit more distant from my initiative. Then as I learned more about source, feeling like, oh my God, like I can't separate it from myself. Like it's like you feel like you are the same thing, which is obviously unhealthy and not good. And then needing to like remove myself again. But like from that new place of understanding, like, okay, this initiative is separate from me. It has its own purpose that's evolving, but like I have a specific relationship to it, and everyone else has a specific relationship that has different characteristics.
I
So
sometimes
like
feel a helpful
decoupling and recoupling.
Yeah, exactly. And it could even be, you're a fairly new mom with a toddler child, right? And I think it's a little bit like parenthood, right? So you have a child, you have a responsibility for this child, but you do not own this child. And that's important, right? So to own the responsibility you carry, but at the same time not have ownership of the thing. And as I'm looking through the chat, I'm sort of wondering, Johannes, because you also work as a consultant, I'm sort of curious about the question that Michelle asked about what happens when you are an external consultant, you work with organizations where no one is stepping into source role. How do you approach this? How do you support them?
Yeah, and quickly weaving in one thing as well. There can be multiple sources, but they might be sourcing different things. So you have actually like 2 or 3 organizations happening in one. So the source principles don't forbid that. The question is just then who follows. And from the consultancy perspective is now when a project comes in, I'm always asking, is there somebody in the organization who's sourcing this, either this collaboration or the whole organization? And it quite often happens that there is nobody really with a sourcing energy, because in corporate settings or in bigger organizations, this sometimes is lost. And then I'm asking myself, do I step in with my own sourcing energy because they actually pull me in because they need someone setting something up? But then I know the moment that I'm going out, I'm taking the sourcing energy again, and something will, if it has not instilled other sources inside, or I've handed something over, it will not happen. But what I really try to find out is, or maybe like tickle the client as long as I really find somebody who's like ready to step into sourcing energy, and then I'm supporting them. And this is sometimes like really a journey of finding that out. And I'm more drawn now to this idea of holding myself back until I have understood how much of my sourcing in which context I should bring in.
Yeah. And you touch upon another important bit, which is the whole question. If you do source something as an external in any company you work with, then that question of how do you hand it over, right? How do you make sure it doesn't collapse when you leave? And I'm realizing there's a million more things we could be talking about, but we want to get to a space where you, as all the participants who are here, have a moment to really explore with each other what is resonant, what is coming up. So before I ask sort of the final question to you, Francesca and Johannes, I would ask you again all to please change your name and put a 1 before your name if you want to be participating in the breakouts. If you don't have that 1 in there, we will probably put you back into the waiting room, because this is meant to be an interactive space, not just, us preaching to you. And once we come back from the breakouts, we'll have time to debrief with you for a bit. But Francesca, sort of last question, if you look back on your own journey, what is the thing that you wish you would have known earlier? Or, somebody, you could also say, what would you now recommend to somebody who's newly founding, if we want to turn it into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it relates actually to also what we were talking about earlier in these ecosystems where there's a lot of different initiatives, that you sometimes end up having multiple projects that are actually happening in parallel, and people think it's one, but it's actually not. And so I think I would have done things from a very different place 10 years ago, or in different moments. If I would have known about this, I think it would have helped as I'm starting things to be really conscious of like, oh, what creative field am I starting it in? Or is it a separate thing? And as different people are coming in, as I'm inviting in people, what is my intention, or where am I seeing that? And being able to have a conversation with a person who's joining to actually really align understanding of what's going on. And yeah, I think that would have made a huge difference to be operating from that clarity, even though sometimes you can't be clear on everything, but even knowing what you're not clear about. And I can see now that I was not, and it can be a lot of work to then help re-clarify later on.
And Johannes, how about you? What would have been helpful, or what advice would you give somebody who's now beginning a new initiative?
So my biggest learning is really the relationship to source. And with that, I mean the person being the source. Do you have, in any initiative, in any relationship that you have, do you have that relationship to source? And it could be yourself, and it could be somebody else, and really paying attention to that, because yeah, it could have saved a lot of pain, but also looking back, I would say I learned a lot from it. So it's rather like I now really consciously decide when I step in and contribute and when not. And I'm, as I shared, really on this personal journey of like, what is something that's so important for me that I really want to source it because I now know what all the things are that that come with it, and I want to be really careful about it.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, again, we could talk for the next hour, no doubt, including also even more from the chat, but now it's time to go into an exploration for all of you.
Thank you for joining us for this session. And before you leave, I just wanted to share a few ways that you can continue your journey, both in the festival and also in exploring this topic of source in the context of shared leadership and collective organizing. So the Networks Festival is contribution and donation based. So we do really appreciate if you can contribute to the festival through our donation page. You can see we're tracking the donation status based on also the needs. So yeah, just wanting to direct you again towards that. We also really invite you to connect with all of our hosts of the session today, myself, Johannes, and Nadja. We're really happy to connect with you on LinkedIn and continue the conversation. There's also a couple other sessions at the Networks Festival that might be of interest that connect with this, such as Thriving Networks in Practice, and some key foundations around self-organizing and basically working with less traditional organizing structures around generative decision-making and also how to work with roles. Going beyond the festival, there's some really useful resources that we wanted to point you towards. One is an interview that I did actually a few years ago with Peter Koenig, where we especially unpacked this topic of how source actually shows up in the context of collective leadership. And it's a really good conversation. Apart from that, there's also some really great foundational articles from Nadja and Johannes that will also be linked alongside this video, just like all of these things that I'm mentioning here. There's a really great scorecard around source-driven collaboration that Johannes has started developing, as well as 2 courses that might be interesting for you to dive into deeper. One called Thriving Networks that I run with some of my colleagues in Greaterthan, that's specifically around supporting networks work differently with money, value, and leadership. And then the CU Source course, which is quite a new program that focuses really on helping people develop and apply source principles in their work. Beyond that, one other link that I'm also going to be sharing with this video is that I am offering open mentorship, sparring partner, thinking partner, and advisory conversations around this topic of source and shared leadership until the end of June as a special offer. So you're welcome to book me and jump into a conversation if that's something that is of interest. Thank you so much for joining us and for watching this, and hope to see you again soon in many other spaces.